Welcome to Horror Echo. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from in the time. Now, relax and join me on a journey into the unknown. The Shadow in the Snow. It was the winter of 2016 when it all began, though I can't recall the exact month, just that it was cold, and the ground was blanketed with fresh snow. At the time, I was in my late 20s, working at a tech firm with a steady job that I had no reason to leave. Life was simple, routine, and I had a girlfriend, Emily, who I'd been with for a few years now. We were happy, living together in a small house that was once owned by my grandparents. I had inherited it, and it felt good to carry on the legacy. The house was old, built in the 1940s, and had a certain charm. Situated on a quiet street at the edge of town, it had a sprawling backyard that connected directly to a vast forest. The woods were thick, dark, and mysterious, an area I had spent many childhood hours exploring. My brothers and I would hike into those woods for what seemed like hours, only to lose ourselves among the dense trees. The woods had always been an escape for me, a place to get away from the noise of the world. Emily and I had moved into the house a few months prior, and everything seemed to be going well. But that morning, Sunday, to be exact, everything changed. It was just after 8 a.m. when I was stepping out of the house, ready to grab my usual coffee from the local diner. I opened the front door, and my eyes immediately caught something strange in the driveway. Snow had fallen overnight, and there, right next to my car, were a series of footprints. At first, I thought it was Emily. Maybe she had gone outside early without waking me. But the more I looked, the more confused I became. The footprints didn't lead to the door, nor did they follow any logical path. They started from the woods behind our house and trailed across the yard to my car. What was even stranger was that they didn't lead up to the front door or any of the windows. They just stopped abruptly at the driver's side of my car and then turned back, heading straight back into the woods. There was no explanation. The prints weren't from Emily, as I later confirmed when I asked her about it. She had still been asleep when I left. The footprints didn't seem to make sense. Who would walk into our yard from the woods, stop by my car, and then leave without any sign of stopping or looking around? That was the first instance. I didn't give it much thought at the time, thinking it was just some strange coincidence. But over the next few years, similar things would happen, each more unsettling than the last. Fast forward to 2018. Emily and I had been living in the house for about 3 years now, and I had almost become used to the odd feeling that came with the woods being so close. There had been other strange occurrences in the house, doors that would creak open by themselves, objects moving when no one was around, but I had chalked it up to old house quirks. But one morning in January, I woke up to something I couldn't ignore. I stepped outside, expecting to find the usual snow-covered driveway, but instead, I was greeted with an eerie sight. There were footprints all over the yard, everywhere. They crisscrossed in every direction, surrounding the house, leading to and from the woods. It wasn't just a single set of prints, but dozens, maybe even hundreds. Some were small, others large, some fresh, some old. I stood there frozen, trying to make sense of it. No one had come by the house, and Emily had been inside the whole morning. I knew this for a fact because we had made breakfast together earlier. The idea that someone could have been walking around our house without us noticing seemed impossible. I quickly texted Emily to let her know what I had found. "Don't go outside until I get back," I wrote, my stomach tightening as a sense of dread crept over me. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I drove off to work, my mind already preoccupied with the unsettling discovery. Later that afternoon, I left work early, unable to concentrate. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When I pulled into the driveway, Emily was waiting for me in the yard, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "I found something," she said, her voice trembling. She led me around the side of the house to the backyard, where I saw what she had discovered. There, in the snow, was a set of footprints leading from the woods to the back door of our house. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the fact that the footprints weren't human. They were large, elongated, and there was something almost animalistic about the way they were imprinted in the snow. The toes were spread wide, and the shape didn't resemble anything I had ever seen. They weren't from a bear, deer, or any other animal native to the area. They seemed to belong to something else, something that didn't belong in our quiet neighborhood. That was when the fear set in. I had always thought I was safe in the woods, but now it felt like the woods had a way of reaching into our lives, pulling us into something far more sinister than I could have imagined. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. The footprints continued to appear, always in the snow, always leading to the house and always from the woods. We tried everything, locking doors, closing windows, making sure everything was secure, but it didn't matter. Whatever was out there seemed to be able to get inside, and it seemed to know exactly where we were. Then, one evening, as I was heading out to take the garbage to the curb, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing just inside the tree line at the edge of the woods. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, staring, watching. I froze, not daring to move or make a sound. For what seemed like hours, I stood there, not knowing if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I finally gathered the courage to look again, the figure was gone. No trace, no footprints, nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. But I knew it was real. I had felt its presence. Things calmed down for a while after that. The strange occurrences stopped, and the feeling of being watched faded. But the woods were still there, dark and endless, waiting for something to return. And deep down, I knew that whatever it was that had been leaving those footprints, it wasn't done with us yet. I don't know if we'll ever truly be safe in that house, but I do know this: whatever lurks in those woods is something ancient, something that has been there long before we ever arrived. And one day, I fear, it will come back to finish what it started. It wasn't long before I started noticing other things, small, almost imperceptible changes that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Things that could easily be explained away, but taken together, they formed a pattern that couldn't be ignored. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home and found Emily pacing in the living room, her eyes darting nervously to the window every few seconds. "I don't like it here anymore," she confessed, her voice tight with anxiety. "I've been hearing things, at night. Scratching noises. Like something's trying to get in." I tried to reassure her, but I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. It was old, after all, and creaks and groans were a part of life in a house like ours. But the more I listened, the more I realized there was something unnervingly deliberate about the sounds. That night, I stayed awake, keeping watch by the window. Emily had already fallen asleep, her breathing slow and steady, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A faint scraping, followed by a slow, deliberate tapping on the glass. My heart thudded in my chest as I crept toward the window. Outside, in the darkness, I could barely make out the shadowy outlines of the trees in the woods. But something was there, something that didn't belong. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its presence. It was as though the air itself had thickened, weighed down by an unnatural energy. I held my breath, straining to see. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, half hidden among the trees, slowly creeping closer to the house. My stomach dropped. There it was again, that feeling. The thing that had been haunting me for months now, lurking just out of sight, waiting for its moment to strike. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture, hoping that somehow, seeing it through the lens of the camera might make it feel more tangible, more real. But when I checked the photo, the figure was gone. The trees were empty, and the night looked still and calm. Emily stirred in her sleep, and I knew I couldn't keep her awake any longer. I went to bed, my mind racing with possibilities. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was just a shadow, or some animal, or even a neighbor out for a late-night walk. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. I felt it in my bones. The next few days passed in a haze. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. The footprints continued to appear in the snow, though now they seemed to change their shape, becoming more erratic, more chaotic. The woods felt alive with something dark and malevolent. One weekend, Emily and I decided to take a walk in the woods. We needed a break from the constant tension in the house. I thought that maybe, just maybe, being out there would help us feel better. We had always enjoyed hiking together, and the woods had always been a place of comfort for me. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew heavier. The trees seemed to close in around us, and a strange silence settled over everything. It was as if the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves had been swallowed up by the thick air. The farther we walked, the more unsettled I felt. Emily must have felt it too, because she kept glancing over her shoulder, her footsteps quickening. "I don't like this," she said, her voice trembling. "I think we should go back." I agreed. It was like the woods themselves were pulling us in, as if they didn't want us to leave. But as we turned to head back to the house, we saw something that made my blood run cold. Up ahead, just beyond a cluster of thick trees, there was a small clearing. And in the middle of the clearing was a figure standing motionless, staring directly at us. We couldn't see its face clearly, but its outline was unmistakable. Tall, thin, and draped in shadows that seemed to twist and warp around it. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching us. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her along, urging her to move faster. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the house, but even then, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. That night, I stayed awake again, my eyes glued to the window. The figure in the woods haunted me, and I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I had no idea what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The following days were a blur. I spent every waking moment trying to figure out what was going on. Who, or what, was stalking us? And why had it targeted us? Then, one evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, I returned home to find Emily standing in the living room, holding something in her hands. It was a photo of the woods behind the house. But it wasn't just any photo. It was a photo of us, taken from the woods. I stared at the picture, my throat tightening. It showed Emily and me, walking down the driveway, completely unaware that we were being watched. But the most unsettling thing was that it had been taken recently. The trees in the background were covered in snow, and the shadows of the woods loomed dark and menacing. My mind raced. How had this photo been taken? Who had been out there, watching us? Emily looked at me, her face pale. "Do you think we should leave?" she asked softly. I didn't have an answer. We couldn't leave, it was our home, after all. But I knew that something was wrong, something beyond what either of us could understand. The figure in the woods had been watching us for months, and now it seemed to know everything about us. We had no idea how to protect ourselves from whatever was lurking out there. But one thing was clear. It wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. The woods were no longer just a place of memories for me. They had become something darker, something evil. And I had no idea how to escape it. The haunting presence of the woods had followed us back into the house. We couldn't outrun it. No matter how far we went, the woods would always be there, watching, waiting. And as I lay in bed that night, I could feel it again. The weight of those eyes, peering in through the windows, lurking in the shadows, never letting us forget, never letting us escape. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with us yet. And it would never stop until it had us. The days blurred into one another. Emily and I didn't talk much. It was like we were both waiting for something we couldn't see but could feel, that constant presence in the background, watching, always lurking just out of sight. That next weekend, we decided to do something that might help us feel like we still had control over our lives. We scheduled a visit to a local psychic, a woman known to have experience with supernatural occurrences. I know it sounds ridiculous, but at that point, we were desperate for answers. We needed something to explain the strange events happening around us. We needed something to make sense of the fear that had been suffocating us for so long. The psychic lived in a small, run-down house at the edge of town, her place a sharp contrast to the wooded isolation of our home. When we arrived, she greeted us with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting us. There was a strange air about her, calm, but her eyes were sharp, like she could see into the depths of your soul. "You're not here because you're curious," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You're here because you're being hunted." I froze. Emily gasped, her hand gripping mine tightly. The psychic didn't wait for us to say anything, just motioned for us to sit. Her eyes flickered to the door, then back to us. "I've seen this before. The woods," she continued, her gaze distant. "Something ancient, something evil, has been waking up. It's drawn to the land, to the darkness in those trees. And it has chosen you." She paused, as if waiting for the words to sink in, then continued. "This isn't just a simple haunting. No, this goes far deeper. The thing in the woods is not a ghost. It's not human. It is a creature of the forest, something that has existed long before this land was settled. It feeds on fear. And now, it wants you." I couldn't speak. I looked at Emily, who was pale as a ghost, her lips trembling. Neither of us had dared to speak those words out loud before, "It wants us." But hearing her say it with such certainty sent a chill through my entire body. "What do we do?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky. "How do we stop it?" The psychic's face softened with pity. "You can't stop it. Not in the way you're thinking. It's already here, already part of you. It feeds on your fear, your anxiety, your weakness. The only way to fight it is to confront it. But it won't be easy." "Confront it? How?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. The psychic stood, walked over to a shelf, and pulled down a small, tattered book. She handed it to me. "This book contains ancient rituals, ones that were used to banish things like this. But be warned, it's dangerous. If you're not strong enough, it could make things worse." She stared at us, her gaze intense. "If you attempt this, there's no going back." We left the psychic's house in a daze. The weight of her words hung over us, and the book in my hands felt like a burden. What if this was our only way out? What if there was no escape? We spent the next few days researching, reading through the ritual book the psychic had given us. The text was old, difficult to understand, and filled with words we couldn't even pronounce. But as we studied, the fear only grew. The rituals seemed to promise that we could banish the thing that haunted us, but they came with an overwhelming cost. The rituals demanded a deep connection with the forces of nature, and they required strength and willpower that neither of us knew we possessed. The more we read, the more desperate we became. It felt like there was no way forward, no way to avoid the inevitable. The creature in the woods was relentless, and no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, we couldn't outrun it. Finally, we decided we had no choice. We would perform the ritual. We gathered the necessary items, candles, herbs, offerings, and prepared ourselves for the night ahead. We were terrified, but at the same time, we felt a strange sense of resolve. We had to do this. We had to take control of our lives again. That night, as the sky darkened and the wind howled through the trees, we ventured into the woods. The snow was deep, and the ground beneath our feet crunched as we moved forward. Emily held tightly to my arm, her breath quick and shallow. She kept glancing around nervously, and I could tell she was just as scared as I was. The deeper we went, the darker the woods became. The trees seemed to press in on us, their branches creaking like old bones. The silence was oppressive, and every step felt like we were walking into something far more dangerous than we had anticipated. Finally, we reached the clearing, the place where we had seen the figure before. It felt different now, darker, more foreboding. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the air was thick with tension. We set up the ritual as best we could, trying to follow the instructions from the book as closely as possible. The wind howled around us, and I could swear I felt eyes on the back of my neck, watching, waiting. And then, as we began to chant, something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to tremble. A distant sound echoed through the trees, like the low growl of something large, something ancient. It was then that I saw it. The figure from the clearing, but now it was closer. Much closer. It was massive, towering above us, its form a twisting amalgamation of shadow and darkness. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural yellow light, and its mouth stretched open, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The ground beneath us seemed to shake with each of its movements, and the very air was thick with malice. The creature was no longer just a shadow, it was real. And it was angry. I didn't know if the ritual would work, if it could banish this thing from our lives for good. But as I stared into those glowing eyes, I knew that this was our only chance. We finished the chant, and the creature let out a bone-chilling scream. The air around us seemed to pulse, and the trees groaned as if the very earth was in agony. For a moment, everything went silent. The wind died, the creature paused, and the world held its breath. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, the creature lunged toward us. But the ritual had done something. The ground beneath the creature cracked open, and a brilliant light erupted from the earth. The creature screamed in pain, its form writhing as if it were being pulled apart. We ran. We didn't look back. When we reached the house, the light from the clearing still flickered faintly in the distance. The presence in the woods had been pushed back, but we knew it wasn't gone, not forever. The creature may have been banished, but its power would always linger, always waiting for the moment it could return. And so, we live on. Safe, for now, but with the knowledge that whatever haunts those woods, whatever darkness resides there, will never truly be gone. It's waiting. And one day, it will come back. Weeks passed after the ritual, and though the oppressive atmosphere lifted from our house, the peace felt fragile, like the calm before a storm. Emily and I tried to return to a semblance of normalcy, but the weight of what had happened lingered. as if the creature had left a scar on our very lives. The snow melted, the trees began to bud with the arrival of spring, but the woods still felt like a lurking presence, always at the edge of my thoughts. I tried to convince myself that the ritual had worked, that whatever that thing was, we had defeated it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The woods hadn't let go of us, it had merely retreated, biding its time, waiting for another chance. There were nights when I'd wake in a cold sweat, feeling like something, was standing at the foot of our bed, watching. I'd sit up and look into the darkness of the room, but I never saw anything. Still, the feeling remained. I couldn't shake it. Then came the night that everything changed again. It was a Saturday evening. Emily had gone out with friends, and I decided to take the opportunity to do some work around the house. The sun had just set, and the light outside was dimming to a soft blue, casting long shadows across the yard. As I worked in the garage, a strange noise reached my ears, a low, rumbling growl. It didn't come from the woods this time, though. It seemed to come from beneath the earth, as if the ground itself was groaning in pain. I froze, dropping the wrench I had been holding. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the sound grew louder, more intense. It was a sound I recognized. It was the same growl I had heard that night in the woods, the night we performed the ritual. The sound of something ancient, something monstrous. I ran outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to find the source. But the yard was still, the only movement being the trees swaying gently in the breeze. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I glanced around, trying to locate the origin of the noise. It felt like the ground itself was shifting beneath my feet, trembling with a force I couldn't understand. And then, I saw it. From the corner of my eye, I caught the movement, a dark shape just inside the tree line. It was moving slowly, like a predator stalking its prey. My heart skipped a beat as the figure emerged from the shadows, just beyond the reach of the yard light. It wasn't a man. It wasn't human at all. The creature was tall, towering over the trees, its body a twisted amalgamation of shadows and flickering light. Its eyes were glowing once again, and this time, there was no mistaking its intent. It was coming for me. For us. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the wet grass. Fear gripped me, paralyzing my legs as the creature moved closer, its gaze fixed on me like a predator closing in on its next meal. I turned and ran toward the house, adrenaline surging through my veins. But as I reached the front door, I realized something horrifying. Emily was still out. I hadn't heard from her since she left, and now, I was certain that she was in danger. If the creature was after me, it wouldn't stop at the house, it would go after her too. Panic rose in my chest as I grabbed my phone and tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent her a message, hoping against hope that she'd get it in time. But I didn't know how much time we had left. I rushed inside, locked the door, and started looking around the house for anything that could protect us. The woods were closing in on us again, and I didn't know how long it would take for the creature to find its way inside. The sound of a distant howl made my blood run cold. The growl had turned into something more, something deeper, something that echoed through the very air. Then I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, like something was testing the threshold between the house and the outside world. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the window and peered through the blinds. What I saw froze me in place. There, standing in the yard, was the creature again. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them. I counted at least 3 figures, all towering and twisting, their forms shifting and contorting as if they couldn't quite maintain their shape. Their eyes gleamed with an otherworldly yellow light, and they stood still, staring directly at the house as if waiting for something. And then, as if sensing my gaze, one of them turned. Slowly. Its head jerking unnaturally toward the window. Its eyes locked onto mine. I felt the air around me grow thick with dread, the weight of its gaze bearing down on me, pressing on my chest. It wasn't just watching me, it was inside my mind, seeping into my thoughts, filling me with an overwhelming sense of terror. I backed away from the window, my legs shaking, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. It began to move toward the house, its limbs twitching and jerking as if it was a puppet on strings. Each step it took was deliberate, each movement slow but filled with intent. And then the doorbell rang. My breath caught in my throat. I knew it wasn't Emily, she had the key. I rushed to the door and peered through the peephole, but all I saw was the darkness of the night, the figures outside now gone. I hesitated, my hand trembling on the doorknob. Who could it be at this hour? With no other choice, I opened the door, only to find nothing. No one was there. But the chill in the air was suffocating, and the sense of something being right there was unbearable. Suddenly, I heard a voice, quiet at first, a whisper. It came from the darkness of the porch. "Help me!" It was Emily's voice. I stepped outside, calling out to her, but there was no reply. The voice was gone, and only the rustling of leaves remained. I turned back to the house, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the porch light, hidden in the shadows. Emily. But she wasn't right. Her eyes were hollow, her expression vacant, and her body seemed to shimmer with an ethereal glow. She stepped forward, and I froze, unable to move. "Come to me," she whispered, her voice sounding both familiar and alien at the same time. "It's safe now." I knew in that moment that it wasn't her. Whatever was standing on my porch, wearing her face, wasn't human anymore. It was the thing from the woods, using her voice, using her likeness to lure me in. And it wasn't done with us yet. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure in front of me, pretending to be Emily, took another step forward. The hollow, empty eyes, those weren't her eyes. They were too dark, too empty, as though nothing human remained behind them. "Come to me," it whispered again, its voice now colder, more insistent. "We've been waiting for you." I took a step back, but my feet felt like they were cemented to the porch. My brain screamed at me to move, to run, to fight back, but my body refused to obey. I wanted to call out, to scream for help, but I couldn't. The air around me felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the very presence of this thing was draining my energy. I could hear it breathing, slow and deep, like it was savoring my fear. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something, movement in the woods. There were shapes, dozens of them, moving silently through the trees. More of them. More creatures. They were coming closer, closing in on me from all sides. The figure in front of me smiled, and I almost didn't recognize it. It wasn't a smile, it was a grin, wide and twisted, stretching too far across its face. The sight of it made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, my hands fumbling for the door handle, but before I could reach it, the figure spoke again, its voice growing darker, more commanding. "You belong to us now." I finally found my voice. "No!" I slammed the door shut and locked it, but I knew it was no use. The creatures outside could get in. They had already shown us that. They could walk through walls if they chose to. They could slip into the cracks of reality like shadows. And they were getting closer. I ran through the house, trying to think of something, anything, to protect us. There had to be something we could do. We had already tried the ritual, but the thing in the woods had been relentless. It wasn't just a creature. It was a force of nature, something older than anything I could understand. It had gotten inside us, inside our minds, and now it had Emily. I needed to find her. I needed to stop this. But my thoughts were racing, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, something to defend myself with, even though I knew it wouldn't help against whatever that thing was. I glanced outside once more, but the porch was empty now. The figure that had been standing there was gone. Still, the air was charged. I could feel it. I could feel them watching me. I went upstairs, praying that Emily was safe, hoping that this nightmare was just a bad dream. I knew better, though. I knew that whatever had taken her, whatever was pretending to be her, had already claimed her. When I reached our bedroom, I froze in the doorway. There, lying in the bed, was Emily. But this wasn't the Emily I knew. This thing, wore her skin like a suit. The figure turned its head slowly toward me, the hollow eyes locking onto mine. It smiled, that same sickening grin spreading across its face. "No one can save you now," it said in Emily's voice. I dropped the knife. I was paralyzed, staring at the twisted version of the woman I loved. I didn't know what to do, didn't know if I could even do anything. I had failed her. We had failed. This thing had already won. But then, something inside me snapped. A surge of rage and terror mixed together. I couldn't let this thing take her, not like this, not after everything we had been through. With a guttural scream, I ran forward, shoving the thing out of the way. I wasn't thinking clearly, my mind clouded by fear and desperation, but I had to do something, anything. I pulled Emily's limp body out of the bed, away from the creature that wore her face, and dragged her toward the window. I had to get her out of here. There was still a chance, I told myself. There had to be. Suddenly, I heard a low rumble, something from outside. A sound of thunder, but it wasn't from the sky. It was from the woods. The ground began to shake, a deep, throbbing vibration underfoot that rattled the walls and made the windows tremble in their frames. The creatures outside were drawing closer. They were preparing to come inside. They were coming for both of us. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. I had to finish what the ritual had started, but this time, I needed help. I needed the psychic's guidance. With Emily still in my arms, I bolted out of the house and into the yard, the creature's growls echoing in the distance. The snow from the previous year had long melted, but the forest was still dark and oppressive. The night was alive with the sound of something coming, something hungry. I ran toward the woods, feeling the temperature drop as I neared the tree line. It felt wrong, like the air itself was fighting against me, pressing down on me with every step. I found the clearing. The one where we had performed the ritual months ago. The trees seemed to stretch upward into the sky, their twisted branches reaching for me, trying to pull me in. The ground felt soft beneath my feet, as though it was waiting, welcoming me back. But this time, I wasn't alone. The figures were already here, waiting for me. They stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, silent, motionless. I could see their eyes glowing in the dark, and I could feel them drawing closer, surrounding me. The creature that had taken Emily's form stepped forward. "You should have stayed away," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 whispers, all twisted and broken. "But now, you've brought it upon yourself." And then, through the fog of fear and the cold grip of despair, I remembered something. The last part of the ritual, the part the psychic had warned us about. The sacrifice. I glanced down at Emily, her body limp in my arms, the life drained from her. I had no choice. There was no other way to stop them. I placed Emily's body on the ground, whispering a prayer I didn't believe in. I began to chant again, the words more frantic this time, louder, desperate. The creatures seemed to recoil from the words, the air growing thicker with each syllable. The ground beneath us trembled once more. The creatures hissed, the shadows twisting violently, but they couldn't stop the ritual. The ritual that was now irreversible. As I reached the final words of the chant, a blinding light erupted from the ground, shooting up into the sky, and the creatures howled, a screeching sound that pierced through the night. The force of the light pushed me backward, and I lost consciousness. When I woke, the sun was rising. The creatures were gone. The woods were still. Silent. But Emily was gone too. And I knew, deep down, that she would never come back. The woods had claimed her. And I was left alone. Alone in a world where the darkness was always waiting, just beyond the trees. I woke up in the clearing, the sunlight creeping through the trees like fingers stretching across the forest floor. The world felt eerily still. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but something was missing. The oppressive weight that had hung over us for so long had finally lifted, but at what cost? I sat up slowly, my body aching from the violent surge of energy during the ritual. I looked around, disoriented, and then I remembered. Emily. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched the clearing, but there was nothing. No sign of the creatures, no twisted figure of her that had once been. The woods were quiet, too quiet, as if everything was holding its breath. I staggered to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. The world seemed too bright, too peaceful, like the calm after a storm, the kind of calm that only comes when everything has been irrevocably changed. I felt sick to my stomach, empty in a way that words couldn't describe. Emily, the love of my life, was gone. She hadn't just been taken by the creature that wore her face, she was lost forever, consumed by the darkness that had been haunting us. I walked through the woods, not knowing where I was going, my thoughts spinning. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches stretching like skeletal hands. I didn't know if the ritual had worked, or if it had just sent the creatures back into the shadows, waiting for another chance to strike. I reached the edge of the woods and stood there for a long moment, staring out into the distance. Our house was still there, but it felt like a different world now, like something that belonged to someone else, a memory of a life I once had. The house, the yard, the road, all of it seemed so far away now, as if time had stretched and warped while I was trapped in the woods. I couldn't go back. Not like this. I walked back to the house, my mind numb. It felt like the world was moving in slow motion, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The door was still locked, but I opened it anyway, stepping inside. The silence of the house was suffocating. Everything was exactly as we had left it, but it felt wrong. The walls felt too close, the furniture too familiar. Nothing felt like home anymore. It was a house haunted by the memories of what we had lost. I walked through the rooms, aimlessly, my mind struggling to find something to hold on to. But there was nothing. There was no Emily. There was no escaping what had happened. I stumbled to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I grabbed a glass of water, trying to calm the nausea swirling in my stomach. I glanced out the window at the woods, but I didn't look long. The trees seemed to be watching, waiting, and I couldn't bear it. I couldn't stand the thought of them drawing me back in, claiming me the way they had claimed her. But as much as I tried to avoid it, I knew I couldn't escape. I wasn't safe here. Not anymore. The creature in the woods had taken Emily, and it had only retreated for a moment. It wasn't gone. Not really. And it would never stop until it had finished what it started. The woods were still calling to me, their whispers carried on the wind. I knew I would have to go back. I would have to face whatever was waiting for me, whatever had consumed Emily, and whatever would keep coming for me as long as I stayed here. But I couldn't go back alone. I grabbed the book that the psychic had given us, the one that had guided the ritual. The pages were worn now, the ink faded in places, but the words were still there, still powerful. I had no choice. I had to finish it. I had to stop it, or I would lose everything. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to bring Emily back. Maybe there was a way to undo the damage, to make things right. I walked to the door, the book clutched tightly in my hands, and I looked back at the empty house one last time. There was nothing left for me here. Nothing but the woods, waiting. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and I made my way toward the tree line. The shadows grew longer as the sun dipped lower, and I felt that familiar presence creeping back into my bones. The woods were alive again. They were aware of me. As I walked deeper into the trees, the feeling grew stronger. It was like a weight on my chest, a presence that pressed in on me from all sides. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for a long time. But this time, I was prepared. This time, I wasn't running. I was going to finish what I had started. I would find a way to break the curse of the woods, or I would die trying. The trees whispered, their voices carried by the wind. The creatures were close, I could feel them. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I opened the book, the ritual in front of me, and began to chant. The ground trembled beneath my feet. The air grew thick with an unnatural energy, and the trees seemed to bend toward me. The creatures appeared, their eyes glowing in the darkness. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I wasn't sure if the ritual would work. I wasn't sure if anything could stop the darkness that had taken hold of this place. But I had to try. For Emily. For myself. And as the chant reached its peak, the creatures screamed, an unearthly, shrill cry that shook the very earth. The ground split open, and a blinding light shot up from the earth itself, engulfing everything in its path. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the voice of the creature, the thing that had taken Emily. It whispered in my ear, as if it was already in my mind. You can't escape us. We are eternal. And then, the world went black. I woke up slowly, disoriented, my head spinning, as though I had been unconscious for hours. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and damp earth, and a sharp, acrid taste clung to my tongue. I blinked, trying to focus, and when my vision cleared, I realized that I was no longer in the woods. I was back at the house. But it wasn't the same. The walls were blackened, the windows shattered, the floor covered in debris. Everything looked abandoned, like the house had been untouched for years, though it hadn't been that long since I last left. The entire place felt wrong. It felt like it had been consumed by something, as if the house itself had been twisted, altered, just like everything else that had happened to us. I stood up shakily, my body bruised and sore, and I took a step forward. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. The ritual, had it worked? Had I succeeded in stopping the creature? Had I destroyed it? Or had I just unleashed something worse? I didn't know. But as I stumbled through the wreckage of the house, I started to feel it again, the presence. It was back. I could feel it crawling under my skin, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. It was like a whisper just at the edge of my mind, a cold, insidious feeling that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I turned to face the front door. The house was silent, save for the soft creaking of the structure as if it was still adjusting to the darkness that had seeped in. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let whatever had taken Emily find me again. I had to leave. But where would I go? Could I outrun this thing? Could I outrun whatever it was that had followed me? Before I could make another move, I heard it. A sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. A soft, slow knock on the door. Not a knock from a human hand. The sound was heavier, more deliberate. A rhythmic thud, as though something massive, something otherworldly, was tapping its fingers against the wood. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The knock came again, louder this time, and the door creaked under the pressure. The darkness outside seemed to pulse with energy, like the very air was alive with it. And then I heard a voice. "Let me in." It was a voice I recognized. The same voice that had come to me in the woods. The voice of the creature. The thing that had taken Emily. But this time, it was different. It wasn't pretending to be Emily. It didn't need to. The voice was deeper now, more sinister, like it had found a new strength, a new power. It wasn't just calling for me, it was demanding. "Let me in," it repeated, its voice echoing through the house, sending chills up my spine. I turned away from the door, my mind racing. I couldn't let it in. I couldn't face that thing again. I had already lost too much. But as I moved toward the other side of the house, I heard the unmistakable sound of the door bursting open. I spun around, and there it was. The creature. Standing in the doorway. But it wasn't like the last time. This time, it was more powerful, more solid. Its shape was clearer now, no longer a shadow. It was a towering figure, its form twisted and unnatural, its eyes burning with that same cold, yellow light. It was real. I could see its every detail, the jagged teeth that filled its mouth, the long, clawed fingers that seemed to stretch toward me like they were reaching into my soul. Its skin was dark, like charred wood, with deep cracks running through it, glowing with an eerie light from within. It was no longer the forest creature that had stalked us, it was something more. It took a step forward, and the ground seemed to groan under its weight. The house itself seemed to shudder as it moved, like the structure was collapsing under the sheer presence of this thing. "You should have stayed away," it said, its voice like a growl, deep and guttural, 1,000 voices melding into one. I backed up slowly, my mind spinning. I couldn't think. There was no plan. There was only the overwhelming urge to escape, to run, to get away from the thing that had followed me here. But it was too late. The creature lunged forward with terrifying speed, and I didn't have time to react. It grabbed me by the arm, its grip like iron, and pulled me toward it. The moment it touched me, a shock of cold pain shot through my body, a feeling like my very soul was being ripped apart. I screamed, but the sound didn't reach my lips. The pain was too intense, overwhelming me. I tried to pull away, but it was futile. The creature dragged me closer, its eyes locking onto mine with that same cold, malevolent gaze. "You belong to me now," it said, its voice echoing in my head, drowning out everything else. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed in was its face, its twisted, monstrous face, grinning, as though it had already won. And then everything went black. When I awoke, I was no longer in the house. I was in the woods again, but this time it felt different. The trees were still towering around me, the air still thick with the oppressive sense of something watching, but there was no creature. No figure lurking in the shadows. The woods felt still. Dead, almost. I stood up slowly, my body aching, my mind racing to make sense of what had happened. The ritual. The creatures. Emily. It all felt like a fever dream, something I couldn't hold on to, something that had slipped through my fingers. And then I saw it. In the distance, among the trees, there was a figure standing still, watching me. It was a shape, a silhouette, but I knew what it was. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I took a step forward, my feet unsteady, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I face it? Was this the end of everything? I had no answers, but one thing was clear. The woods were still here, still calling me, still keeping me trapped. And I didn't know how to escape. The creature hadn't taken me yet. But in the silence of the woods, I understood the truth. I was never meant to leave. The wind whispered through the trees as I stood there, staring at the dark shape in the distance. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just a silhouette, waiting. Waiting for me. The sense of dread that had gripped me since the moment I entered these woods washed over me once more, a cold, suffocating wave. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like lead, as though the very ground beneath my feet was pulling me back, unwilling to let me go. I wanted to escape. I wanted to wake up from this nightmare, but there was no escaping the truth. The woods were alive. The creatures, the thing that had taken Emily, it was all part of something bigger. Something ancient. Something that would never let me leave. The figure slowly began to step toward me. Each movement was deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was too paralyzed with fear. The closer it got, the more its shape became clear, and I could feel the air around me grow heavier, colder. My breath caught in my throat. It was her. At least, it looked like her. Emily. The last face I'd seen before the darkness consumed me. But her eyes, those weren't her eyes. They were dark, empty, like hollow pits. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth twisted into a smile that made my blood run cold. "You thought you could escape?" she asked in a voice that was both hers and something else, something ancient and cruel. "You thought you could defeat us? You're still ours. You always will be." I staggered back, the ground beneath me shaking, the trees groaning as if they, too, were trying to push me away, to warn me. But it was too late. There was no escape. The woods had claimed me, had claimed all of us. And now, I understood. There was no running from it. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for any of this. I just wanted to protect you." But Emily, or whatever was standing in front of me, laughed, a low, hollow laugh that sent a chill through my bones. "You never had a choice," she said. "This is who we are. This is what we are. The woods are eternal. We feed on fear, on pain, on regret. You thought you could stop it, but you were wrong." The ground trembled beneath my feet once more, and the trees around us seemed to pulse, alive with a malevolent energy. The shadows shifted, coiling like serpents, closing in around me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though the air had been sucked out of my lungs, leaving only a hollow emptiness inside me. I turned, looking desperately for some way out, but there was nothing. The woods stretched on endlessly, a labyrinth of twisted trees and shadowed paths. There was no escape from this place. No escape from what it had become. And then, in the distance, I saw them. Figures. Dark shapes, moving silently through the trees. The creatures. They had returned. They were watching, waiting for me to make my next move. But there was no moving. Not anymore. The figure of Emily stepped closer, her face now inches from mine. I could feel her breath on my skin, cold and unnatural. "Don't you see?" she whispered. "You can't leave. You belong to the woods now. We all do." And then, as if in some twisted confirmation of her words, the ground beneath my feet cracked open, and a terrible, deafening roar filled the air. I was falling, tumbling into the darkness, surrounded by shadows that reached up for me, pulling me deeper into the earth. As I fell, I heard the final whisper, the voice of the thing that had followed me all this time, the thing that had been waiting. "You were never meant to escape. You were always part of us." And then, everything went black. When I awoke, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. The world was silent again, but this time, it was different. The air didn't feel suffocating. There was no weight pressing on me. The forest around me was still, quiet, almost serene. But as I sat up and looked around, I knew. I was no longer me. I had become one with the woods. The shadows. The creatures. The eternal darkness. And the forest? It had claimed me. There was no going back. There never would be. I was part of the land now. Part of the story. Part of the never-ending cycle. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the woods, Emily's hollow eyes still watched, waiting for the next one to stumble across the cursed land. Waiting for the next soul to be drawn into the darkness. And so, the cycle continues. The woods are eternal. The woods are patient. And the woods never let go. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.